They said I was too young, but time has a way of making you feel older than your years. At 36, Eleanor Grace had known enough heartache to rival a woman twice her age. Not the grand operatic sort of grief sung about in novels, but the quiet ache of being overlooked, underestimated, and labeled too much or not enough by people who barely knew her name. Her mother had passed when she was just a girl, and her father remarried quickly, handing Eleanor off to chores and silence as though she were a shadow of someone more important. By the time she hit 20, her hands were worn, her back stiff, her voice cautious. She had never been courted, never asked to dance, never told she was beautiful, not in the way young women dream of. By 25, she had answered a newspaper ad as a mail-order bride, thinking perhaps someone out west would find value in a practical, full-bodied woman with a mind for numbers and a heart that longed only to be heard. But even then, when she stepped off that train in a borrowed dress and homemade shoes, the man who was supposed to claim her had taken one look and turned away. She's too young. She won't understand the work. And too heavy set, he muttered, before leaving her with the dust, the silence, and her pride. That was over a decade ago. Now she lived in the shadow of her younger self, older in bones, wiser in spirit, but bruised in ways no one saw. A woman in her mid-30s who hadn't made it, not as a wife, not as a mother, not even as someone worthy of town gossip. She had moved from homestead to homestead, working where needed sewing, cooking, reading at night by candlelight. People called her Miss Grace out of politeness, but rarely did anyone ask where she came from or where she was going. Middle age, she found, was less about the number of years and more about the invisible weight of being forgotten while still breathing. And yet there was something stirring now, something in the dust, the dusk, the way her name had recently been spoken, not with judgment but quiet regard. His name was Elias Monroe, a widowed rancher with a reputation for silence and sorrow. People feared him, but she saw something else. A man who watched without judging. A man who signed words instead of shouting them. A man who, for the first time in Eleanor's long silence, did not turn away. What if your second act, the one they said would never come, held the kind of love that didn't need to be loud to be real? They told her she was too young to understand sorrow. But Ellie Whitlow, just 18, had already known the kind of grief that sits in a woman's bones, quiet, heavy, and without permission to speak. The letter that carried her to Wyoming territory had promised a new beginning. A mail-order bride, they called her. A girl of strong constitution, willing hands, and a pleasant spirit. That's what her ad had said. She had written it herself, trembling over the ink pot by candlelight, while her stepfather's boots thudded against the wooden floor of their Kentucky cabin. She didn't mention the bruises or the nights she spent outside with the dogs. She didn't mention her mother's grave or the years she was kept from books, because girls don't need thinking. No, she only wrote what she hoped would be received with kindness. But when she stepped off that stagecoach in Dry Creek dust, in her teeth, hands raw from clutching her satchel, the man who had sent for her took one look at her and sneered. "You're just a child," he said. "I wanted a woman." That was the beginning of her silence. He left her standing there in front of the post office, a slip of a girl with strong shoulders and quiet eyes, surrounded by townsfolk, pretending not to stare. The stagecoach rolled away, and with it any illusion of rescue. She rented a room with what little she had coin. By coins saved from sewing buttons and scrubbing floors for the neighbors back home. The innkeeper's wife, a narrow-eyed woman named May, gave her a lumpy cot and a boiled egg for supper. No questions asked. Ellie preferred it that way. After all, how could she explain to anyone that what hurt most wasn't the rejection, but the fact that she wasn't even surprised? In the weeks that followed, Ellie took work wherever it was offered. She cleaned barns, mended trousers, nursed a sick child through a fever. Folks began to trust her, even rely on her, but never truly saw her. To them, she was still the girl who got sent back. Too young, too plain, too quiet. But at night, in the stillness of her room, Ellie whispered truce into the pillow. "I am not broken," she told herself. "I am not nothing." She read her one worn Bible by oil lamp, and though the pages smelled of mildew and old grief, she found a strange comfort in the Psalms. David had cried into the wilderness too, and then one morning as she walked down the hill with a pail of milk sloshing against her skirt, she passed the Kerrigan Ranch for the first time. The man by the corral didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at her. Really looked. He was older, perhaps 38, with hair like iron filings and a scar that ran across his jaw. Folks called him the widowed rancher, the one who spoke to no one. A man with pain so deep it never found a voice. But Ellie met his eyes just long enough to know silence sometimes recognizes its own. And so began the quiet story of two people no one wanted, but who might just save each other in the end. The days in Dry Creek blurred into one another like dust on the prairie wind, indistinct, hushed, yet full of meaning if one paused to look close enough. Ellie Whitlow had learned not to speak unless spoken to, but her silence held depth, not absence. It was the silence of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast, of a girl who had stood between her mother and the rage of a drunken man and bore the bruises without flinching. When she'd answered that ad to be a mail-order bride, she had hoped not for love, but for safety, maybe even kindness. But safety had turned its back on her. Still, Ellie did not complain. She earned what she could and watched the town like a quiet ghost. She noticed everything: how Mrs. Lyman at the mercantile always overcharged widows, how young boys bullied the one boy with a limp, how the pastor's eyes softened when he spoke to his wife, but never to the congregation. And she noticed him, the rancher, Elias Kerrigan. He walked with a limp and never spoke to anyone, not even to order goods. He'd simply nod or leave a list. It wasn't until the fourth time their paths crossed near the creek, Ellie fetching laundry water, Elias tending to a limping colt, that she realized something else he couldn't hear. Not that he ever let on, but he'd lean in with his eyes watch, lips study hands. The world had likely called him cold, reclusive, or strange. But Ellie recognized something else. He lived in a world full of noise, but had carved out his place in silence. Just like her. She didn't speak to him that first time, nor the second. But when she noticed his hand bleeding from a split in his glove as he carried a fence post, her fingers moved before thought. She reached into her apron, pulled out a handkerchief, and without a word offered it. He looked startled, guarded, but he took it. Ellie nodded once, turned, and walked away. The next morning at the doorstep of her boarding house, she found the handkerchief washed and folded with a single word stitched into the hem: thanks. He had sewn it. In a town where people muttered about that strange Kerrigan fellow and whispered cruelly behind Ellie's back about being too young, too shy, and too poor to keep a man, a silent exchange stitched more comfort than sermons ever had. And yet, Ellie felt the first flicker of unease. She had come to Dry Creek to escape the judgment of her stepfather, the slap of his hand, and the suffocating gaze of the man who once tried to claim her for debt. What if getting close to anyone meant inviting pain again? But the way Elias looked at her, it was like a man recognizing a hymn he hadn't heard since childhood. One morning while tending to the mayor's laundry, Ellie overheard two women at the back gate. Poor Kerrigan. Ever since his wife died, he's been mute as the grave, and she was a real beauty too. Some say she ran herself off that cliff when she couldn't stand the quiet no more. I'd never survive a man like that. Can't talk. Can't listen. What good's he now? Ellie said nothing, but her cheeks burned. Not from shame, from anger. What kind of world dismissed a man because his voice came in gestures? What kind of town cast off a girl because she didn't flirt or talk loud? Later that week, Elias came to the churchyard as she trimmed the dead rose bushes. He handed her a folded note. Inside, would you help me with the spring calves I can pay? She nodded. Not for the coin, but because it was the first time anyone had asked her for anything that mattered. In a town that never asked her what she felt, one silent man handed her something rare choice. Spring came early to Dry Creek, and the snowmelt brought with it a slow awakening. The air smelled of earth, and buds peeked from bare branches like promises finally kept. For Ellie, the ranch became a place of unexpected rhythm. Mornings began before dawn, her hands in warm milk as she helped tend calves, still wet with birth. Afternoons were filled with mending fences, clearing troughs, gathering eggs. No one spoke much. Elias would write instructions on a slate or simply nod toward what needed doing. She understood. She always had. It was the kind of understanding born not of education, but of watching, feeling, and moving before being asked. There was peace in it, but peace was not the same as ease. One afternoon, after a long day repairing broken fencing near the outer hills, Ellie sat on the edge of the corral, her feet swinging softly above the dust. Elias approached with a tin cup and offered her a drink of cool spring water. He didn't sit beside her. He stood a few feet away, giving her the space most men tried to take. That's when she asked the question that had been nesting in her chest like a thorn bird. Why me? Elias tilted his head. She clarified quieter. Why hire me? The town thinks I'm a burden, a leftover girl. Too young to be smart, too shy to be of use. He took a long moment, then retrieved the slate he often carried in his back pocket. With a piece of chalk, he wrote, I saw the way you stitched that boy's torn trousers. You used blue thread so the men look like sky. That's not something a leftover girl would do. Ellie blinked. Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to being seen. He wrote again, You didn't flinch when I limped, or stare when I fumbled my tools. You never once tried to fill the quiet. You honored it. Tears burned behind her eyes. Not because he was kind, but because his words undid years of silence inside her. Silence she had turned into armor. I'm not afraid of quiet, she whispered. Elias nodded, then wrote, Neither am I. But I was afraid no one would ever understand it. It was the first time she smiled, truly smiled in Dry Creek. But that night, as she sat alone in her rented room above the dress shop, a letter arrived. A wrinkled envelope addressed in crooked handwriting. No return name. Just Miss Eleanor Whitlow. Inside a note. You thought you could run, you're still mine. And I'm coming for what I'm owed. Her breath caught. Only one man wrote like that. Clyde Rowley. The one her stepfather promised her to for the price of a bar tab. The one she'd escaped by hiding in a freight wagon bound west. The one who swore he'd find her. She folded the note with shaking fingers, tucked it beneath her mattress, and curled up on the floor. The peace she had begun to taste now trembled on the edge of ruin. Just as Ellie dared to feel safe in the quiet, a voice from her past threatened to shatter everything. The morning after the letter arrived, Ellie moved like someone walking across thin ice. Her hands were steady, but her breath wasn't. The simple act of cracking eggs into a bowl sent a tremor through her wrist. She told herself it was just the cold. But it wasn't the cold. It was fear she had almost forgotten how to name. She didn't tell Elias, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't know how. She'd only just begun to believe she was more than a burden, more than someone people passed over. To admit the shadows that trailed her, that felt like dragging mud across a clean floor. But the silence grew heavy again. Elias sensed it. One afternoon after she burned the bread and forgot to latch the goat pen, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, slate in hand. He didn't write anything, just waited. Ellie stood across the room, jaw tight, arms folded. I got a letter, she said at last, her voice so soft it might have floated out the window if he hadn't been watching her lips. She pulled the wrinkled paper from her apron pocket and handed it to him. He read it. His mouth tightened, his jaw locking like it had been bolted shut. Then he walked to the stove, threw the letter into the fire, and watched it curl to ash. That won't stop him, Ellie whispered, staring into the flames. Elias scribbled on the slate, but you're not alone this time. She wanted to believe him, but she'd spent years learning how not to depend on anyone. Survival had meant silence, hiding becoming small enough to be forgotten. Now someone had remembered her. The next few days were filled with an anxious waiting. Ellie checked over her shoulder more often. She began carrying a kitchen knife tucked into her boot. She started sleeping in her clothes. And Elias. He became her quiet sentinel. He rode the fence lines longer, reinforced the doors, and started sleeping in the barn. I can take care of myself, she said one night, trying to stand tall. Elias wrote on the slate and showed her. I know, but you don't have to. Not anymore. Her throat caught. No one had ever said those words to her. Not her mother, not her stepfather, not a soul. Still, when the knock came one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the sound was like a gunshot to the ribs. Ellie froze. Elias moved first. He motioned for her to stay back, then opened the door slowly. The man standing there wore a smirk and a filthy duster coat. His teeth were yellow. His left eye had a twitch. Evening, he drawled. I'm looking for a girl. Goes by Eleanor. 'Bout this high. Bit on the soft side. She owes me something. Ellie's hand gripped the knife in her pocket. Her legs trembled. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. I don't owe you anything, Clyde. His eyes lit up like a match. There she is. My little bride. Elias stepped between them. Clyde spat to the side. Who's the mute? Ellie drew her breath and said something she hadn't dared say in years. He's the man who knows my worth. Clyde's smile slipped. Elias didn't blink. He held Clyde's gaze like a man who'd wrestled ghosts and won. I'm taking her, Clyde said. You can't stop me. Elias calmly pulled back his coat just enough to reveal the pistol holstered at his side. Clyde chuckled. But the chuckle didn't last. You think this is over? He hissed, backing down the porch. No, Ellie said, voice shaking, but sure. I think it's just beginning. As Clyde turned and rode off into the dark, Elias closed the door and bolted it. Then he turned to Ellie, who was now trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of standing up. I'm tired of running, she whispered. Elias reached out and placed his hand over hers. So was he. She faced the man who once owned her with trembling knees but a steady voice. Now the storm was coming, but so was her courage. There's a strange kind of silence after fear breaks. Not peace, at least not yet, but a quiet ache, like the wind over a battlefield once the bullets have stopped flying. That's what it felt like in the days after Clyde's visit. Eleanor no longer waited to breathe. She didn't flinch at every sound. But something inside her had cracked open, and now the light was pouring in, and with it the weight of all she'd kept buried. It was Elias who noticed first. He'd always been watchful, not in the controlling way men often were, but in a way that said, I see you, and I will not look away. He kept handing her the slate, but more often Eleanor spoke instead. Sometimes only a sentence. Other times she surprised them both with full stories of the years before the man who forced her into a sham of marriage and how every word she spoke had been used against her. But now her words were no longer stolen. They were her own. One late afternoon, she found Elias on the porch fixing the latch on the door Clyde had banged open. She sat beside him and held out a cup of water. He took it, their fingers brushing. I want to stay, she said. Her voice didn't waver this time. Even if he comes back, even if I'm scared. He nodded slowly, then passed her the slate. Then we prepare, together. That night, they sat in the parlor candlelight, soft against the walls. Eleanor held her sewing in her lap, but her hands were still. Ellis was sketching something he often did when his thoughts were tangled, and she leaned over to see. It was a simple pencil drawing. Her, sitting beneath the cottonwood tree near the barn. Alone. Quiet. But there was something in the way he had drawn her eyes, focused steady-wide with thought. You see me, she said softly. He didn't need to write a reply. That was the night Eleanor realized she didn't just want to stay, she wanted to belong. And she didn't want to be a burden, a shadow in the corners of someone else's home. She wanted to be part of the building, the mending, the naming of things. So the next morning she woke early. She kneaded bread, gathered eggs, fed the goats, and by sunrise she'd already made 2 lists, one for what needed fixing on the ranch, and one for what she needed to fix inside herself. Clyde might return. She couldn't control that, but she could control who she'd become when he did. And in that knowing there was freedom. When she caught Elias watching her work, there was something different in his gaze, respect, yes, but also awe. He had lived among cattle storms and men who wouldn't speak, but he'd never seen a woman rebuild herself from the ground up while smiling softly through the dust. Later that week, a neighbor passed by and mentioned they'd seen Clyde heading toward town again. Fear tried to sneak back in, but Eleanor didn't hide. Instead, she walked with Elias to the corral and helped him train the new filly, her voice steady as she called instructions. He still thinks I'm his, she said when the sun began to set. Elias wiped sweat from his brow and met her eyes. What do you believe? She didn't answer right away. Then she turned toward the house, her voice low. I think I've finally stopped waiting for someone to rescue me. She didn't see Elias smile behind her, but she felt it warm as the fading light. She'd spent her life waiting to be claimed, but now she was claiming herself. And someone quiet, watching from the shadows, was ready to walk beside her into the storm. It happened on a Sunday. The wind had been restless since morning, tossing tumbleweeds against the fence, like it sensed something wasn't right. Eleanor was pulling warm bread from the oven when she heard the sharp crunch of hooves on gravel. She didn't need to look. She knew. Clyde had returned. Elias stood on the porch, arms folded across his chest, eyes cold. He said nothing as Clyde dismounted, the man's boots stomping across the earth like a threat. Clyde's eyes were just as Eleanor remembered, small, mean, quick to judge. But what startled her now was that they no longer terrified her. Came to take what's mine, he spat, jerking a thumb toward the cabin. That girl belongs to me. Eleanor stepped outside. She wasn't trembling. Not this time. I was never yours, she said quietly. And I won't go back. Clyde barked a laugh. You think this old shack and this mute cowboy make you free? You signed papers, girl. You're my wife in the eyes of the law. But Elias was already reaching inside his coat slowly, calmly, and produced a folded sheet of paper. He handed it to Clyde. It was a legal notice, filed by the sheriff nullifying Clyde's claim due to falsified marriage documents, mistreatment, and abandonment. Elias had ridden into town days ago, prepared everything. He hadn't told Eleanor, not because he didn't trust her, but because he trusted she needed to face him on her own terms. Clyde's face paled. You got no right, she has every right, Elise said, his voice grave low. And if you try to take her again, you'll have to answer to me, and to the law. Clyde's bluster cracked. For the first time he looked unsure. Maybe it was Elias's stance. Maybe it was Eleanor standing so still and unafraid beside him. Or maybe it was the townsfolk watching from the distance, hands resting casually near their hips. In a final act of petty cowardice, Clyde spat on the dirt, then turned, mounted his horse, and galloped off without another word. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She didn't even sigh. She simply turned to Elias and said, "Thank you." But Elias shook his head. "You did that," he mouthed, "not me." That night she sat at the edge of her bed, fingers brushing the worn pages of her journal. The girl who had boarded a train months ago, the one who believed silence made her small, who had been told she was too young, too soft, too weak, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth. She turned to Elias, who was watching her from the chair near the window. "You saw me when I was invisible," she whispered. He stood, walked over, and knelt beside her, reaching for her hand. "You were never invisible," he mouthed. "They just refused to look." And then finally Eleanor let the tears come. Not from fear, not from shame, but from the release of carrying herself alone for too long. Outside, the wind calmed. Inside, something stronger than fear took root. The storm had come and gone, but what remained was something braver than she ever imagined, the quiet power of a woman who stood her ground. Spring crept into the hills, softening the hard lines of winter with wildflowers and honey light. But for Eleanor, the real thaw was happening within, quietly, without ceremony, like snow melting under the warmth of something constant. It wasn't that everything was perfect now. The townsfolk still whispered sometimes when she passed. The general store clerk still gave her a once-over before offering a smile, and some of the church ladies still hesitated before inviting her to their sewing circle. But Eleanor no longer bowed her head in shame. She stood tall, her figure full, and proud, her eyes steady. She wore her hair loose now, sometimes in a braid Elias would quietly fix in the evenings, his fingers gentle and sure. They had not spoken of marriage, not in the way folks expected anyway. One evening, as the sky burned gold behind the hills, Eleanor sat beside Elias on the porch swing. He had just mended the gate, and she had spent the day stitching a new dress from leftover muslin. Their hands were tired, their clothes smelled of sun and dust, and their hearts rested in the rhythm of this shared silence. I used to think Eleanor began that love needed to be grand to matter. Big gestures, fancy dresses, folks clapping in churches. Elias turned to her, brow raised in question. "But now I know," she continued, voice soft, "love is when someone sees all of you, your shame, your silence, your past, and stays anyway." He reached into his pocket, not with nervousness, not with performance, but like a man simply making something right. He pulled out a simple silver ring. No flourish, no kneeling, just truth. He signed slowly, looking into her eyes. "No audience, no preacher, just me asking you to stay as you are." She didn't cry. Not this time. She placed her hand over his and whispered, "You already have all of me." They would quietly the next day. No church bells, no flowers, just the two of them beneath the cottonwood tree near the barn where Elias had carved their initials weeks before. Margaret, the widow from town, brought pie. The children from the schoolhouse brought a song. And Eleanor, once told she was too young, too fat, Too Quiet was now the center of a family she'd built, not been handed. She baked bread. She sang to the cows. She ran the books for Elias's cattle operation and taught reading to the neighbor's daughter. She laughed freely. She rested without guilt. And sometimes late at night she would walk barefoot through the fields behind the cabin and lift her face to the moon. She'd whisper not prayers but gratitude for the girl she had been, for the woman she had become, and for the man who never asked her to change. Not all love stories are loud. Some arrive like dusk on the prairie, quiet, golden, and full of promise. And if you're lucky, you live long enough to walk into them fully seen. Some hearts don't bloom until later in life, and that's not a flaw, but a quiet kind of grace. Eleanor's story reminds us that the world often moves too fast to see the wisdom in silence, the strength in gentleness, or the worth of a woman who's lived through rejection without growing bitter. Too often we're told we've missed our chance, whether it's for love, respect, or purpose. But as her journey shows, time doesn't erase value. If anything, it deepens it. In a world that prizes loudness, Eleanor teaches us the beauty of restraint. In a culture that worships youth, she shows the richness of experience. And in an age of quick love and quick goodbyes, she reminds us that the truest relationships take root slowly through patience, recognition, and quiet bravery. So if you've ever felt too old, too much, or simply unseen, take heart. There's still room in your story for kindness to find you. There's still someone out there who sees the beauty others missed. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your reflections, or your own story in the comments. And if these kinds of heartfelt, healing Western stories speak to your soul, subscribe to Wild West Saga and join our growing family of kindred spirits. Because some of the most powerful stories begin right when everyone else thinks yours is ending.